Welcome to my messy studio. My name is Mark, and I'm an artist and an art professor. And in this video, I'm going to show you two of the most effective training methods you can do to improve your ability to work with color. This is an exercise that I have been assigning to my students for over 20 years, one that works in any dry or wet color media, whether it be transparent watercolor, chalk pastel, acrylics, or oils. Let's get started. But before I do, two things I need to tell you. First, I'll be running another round of online workshops this fall, starting with my Fundamentals of Crosshatching course, followed by my follow-up course called Drawing Details and Textures. Second, please consider becoming a channel member, which will give you access to a library of full-length tutorials with 2 new videos every single month. The online workshops and the channel membership program, and let's not forget, my streaming downloadable classes through Vimeo, are a great way to support my channel and get access to detailed long-form instruction. Okay, back to the regularly scheduled program. My painting classes, regardless of the medium, usually follow the same structure. The first week I introduce the materials and then demonstrate, after a lecture on basic technique, how to paint a simple still life in black and white. The following week we start working in color, but not every color, only 2 if you're dealing with watercolor, burnt sienna, which if you're not familiar with is a dark orange-brown, and ultramarine blue, which is a deep blue which leans ever so slightly towards purple. If this class is in an opaque media, we would also add white paint, but in watercolor our white will be the white of the paper. Limiting the number of colors when learning to paint is an age-old training method, since it's very easy for the beginner to get overwhelmed with using a full palette of colors. This severely limited palette is a great starting point, allowing students to focus on the 3 elements of color mixing: value, saturation, and temperature, without the mind-boggling complication of 3 different kinds of blue, 2 different kinds of green, 5 different kinds of yellow, and so on. Burnt sienna, being a dark orange, is a complementary color to ultramarine blue, which means that they're on the opposite sides of the color wheel and therefore cancel each other out when mixed together, turning a dark gray. These 2 colors allow you to mix a surprising amount of colors, and of course, in opaque media, where you're also using white, even more colors. The first part of the exercise involves painting a simple still life composed of objects in the same limited range of color. I prefer to have the students work from observation, but in an illustration classroom not set up for observational painting, I allow students to work from photographs, as we're going to be doing right now. 2, 4, 5. Here's the reference I've been torturing my students with for something like 2 decades. As a still life, it's of course nothing special, but as an exercise, I think there's tremendous benefit to be had from copying it. Let's get to it. Before starting the exercise, let's talk about the paint I'm going to use. Here's an important point. Burnt sienna comes in 2 varieties. There's a natural burnt sienna and there's a synthetic burnt sienna, and these 2 pigments perform quite differently in practice. The name for the natural pigment is PB7, and the name for the synthetic pigment is PB101. And let me show you the difference quickly. So I'm going to squeeze out a little bit of the natural burnt sienna. Here is the synthetic burnt sienna. There's usually quite a bit of variety with the natural version of the color, depending on its source. And sometimes paint companies will also sneak the synthetic pigment into the natural color. But generally speaking, the natural burnt sienna is a little bit more muted. It's darker. Doesn't quite have the saturation that synthetic burnt sienna has. So let's compare that to the synthetic version, which you can see is considerably brighter, more saturated. In practice, the natural burnt sienna is also going to have a slightly larger pigment particle, which means when it's dry, it's going to look a little bit grainier. And the synthetic version, because it's an artificial, synthetically produced pigment, is usually finer. It's going to create smoother washes. For this exercise, either pigment is perfectly fine, but I use the natural version. That's the one I'm going to use for this exercise. As far as the ultramarine blue, You want to gravitate towards French ultramarine. Why? Because it has a little bit of purple in it, which is going to prevent your mixtures from going green, especially if you're using the synthetic version of burnt sienna. So let's squeeze out a little bit of French ultramarine. The main thing to look for is when you mix your burnt sienna and your ultramarine, they should make a perfectly neutral gray. And you can see, because my French ultramarine is a little bit on the purple side, when I mix it with my synthetic burnt sienna, it still manages to be fairly neutral. However, if you purchase an ultramarine that's a little bit on the greener side, so sometimes you'll see tubes of ultramarine that say green hue. If you mix them with synthetic burnt sienna, what you're going to get is a dull green mixture that's going to be unpleasant and not going to be useful for this particular exercise. Again, the most important thing is that when you mix the two colors together, they form neutral gray. That's what you're looking for. Which means when choosing your blue, it should be either French ultramarine. You can also use cobalt blue, but certain cobalt blues lean green. So for example, this particular cobalt blue, which is a little bit more green than my French ultramarine, if I combine it with my synthetic burnt sienna, I'm going to get, if I get the right proportion here, a mixture that's going to be a touch on the greener side, which again is not something that I want. Watercolor is a very flexible medium, and there are a lot of different ways of working, but my general approach looks like this. Big to small, background to foreground, meaning that the first things I do in a painting is put in the larger area of color, and then, generally speaking, I also start with the background and work towards objects that are closer and closer. Now, in practice, I often violate these rules. Why? For the sake of time. So if I put down a background, I might choose to work on things that the background is not touching. Otherwise, I'm going to get bleeding from one area to the other. And especially if I'm working in the field where I don't really have time for things to dry, I'll violate that rule a lot. In the studio, when I'm working with a hairdryer, I tend to be slightly more systematic. But even then, for the sake of the demo, to keep things continuous, I'm not going to use a hairdryer. So you're going to see me jumping around a lot from one thing to the other. All right. But in this case, we have some larger areas of color to fill in, and one of them is the background. So let's start off with the background first. Let's mix up some color. I have my French ultramarine here. Let's mix it with some burnt sienna. And when mixing a color, I'm paying attention to three things. I'm paying attention to the value, obviously. I'm paying attention to the color, obviously. But I'm also, and this is particularly important in this exercise, also paying attention to something that's related to color: warm and cool, warmth and coolness. So when I'm mixing a color, I'm also thinking about whether it's a warm color or a cool color. Now, in this severely restricted palette, if I'm looking for a cool color, I'll lean more towards my ultramarine blue. If I'm looking for a warm color, I lean more towards burnt sienna. So let's start off with a mixture that looks like this. By the way, it's always good to have a little test sheet next to you when you're working so you can test the color out before you put it down. But here is just about the most important rule of working in color. Keep the color moving. What does that mean? That means that I'm not going to mix up one big pile of color and put it everywhere. I'm going to think about how that color changes, how it moves. So if we're looking at the background here, the color is one thing here, and then as we move this way, it changes slightly. It changes slightly here. It changes slightly here. The color is constantly shifting, even on a simple flat plane like this. And when I'm mixing up the color, I'm not just thinking about the value, I'm thinking about the way the color changes. So for instance, here the color is, what would you call this? Like a warm gray, almost like a beige, right? As the color moves this way, what happens to it? To my mind, maybe you're seeing something else, it's very subtle. The color gets darker and also slightly warmer. So as I go this way, I'm going to mix a little bit more burnt sienna into my wash. So let's start off by wetting the background. It's gonna, oh, my brush is dirty. Let's clean it slightly. Okay, so I'm just gonna wet the background. That's gonna give me a smoother wash. For a small painting like this, it's not terribly necessary to do this. By the way, I have my painting at a slight tilt. It's probably about 10 degrees. When you're doing pure watercolor, having that kind of tilt is pretty helpful. And when I wet the paper, I don't soak it. So the paper is ever so slightly wet. I don't want pools of water anywhere. So one thing that helps is to look at your paper from the side and eliminate any areas where water is pooling up. It's going to give you uneven results. Okay, now let's put in our background color. So as mentioned, it's kind of a warm gray here, like this. And then what happens to the color as it gets darker? It warms up. That warmth is very, very slight. I'm trying not to exaggerate it too much. Perhaps I overdid it slightly here. I think it's going to be fine. Okay, here the color gets a little bit cooler, probably because it's reflecting light off the blue paper towel. Keeping the color moving is a very important principle. For a number of reasons. First of all, it's accurate. That's what's actually happening. Color is indeed moving. It is indeed changing. But it also serves to make your painting much more interesting. The more color information you add, the more subtle your painting is going to be. So here it starts going a little darker and a little more blue. Here it's getting a little bit lighter, a little more burnt sienna. Because we have limited options in the way you mix colors, it allows you to focus exclusively on those important principles of warmth and coolness. So always think about how the color changes. And the more you can pick up on those very, very subtle changes in color, generally speaking, there might be exceptions, the better your painting is going to be. All right, so while this is drying, I think we can probably put in some of those very soft, fuzzy cast shadows in the background. So cast shadows are obviously darker, but here's another important point. There's as much color information in cast shadows, and shadows in general, as there is in every other part of the painting. It's just more subtle. So one big mistake many beginning artists make when mixing shadows is to make the color completely even. Shadows are very subject very highly subject to the colors around them. They're going to reflect things that are around them a lot. So when you're mixing cast shadows, pay close attention to the way the color shifts. In this case, there is a warm around the cast shadow, so the soft fuzzy edge around the cast shadow is on the warmer side. That's number one. And then the shadow itself starts to lean more blue. Now, obviously, I'm not going to be able to pick up every single color I'm seeing. There's some places where things lean a little bit green or a little purple. I don't have access to those colors. But I should get pretty close with the colors I'm mixing. Which leads me to another important point. When you're working with a limited palette, the variety of colors within that limitation is super important. Meaning that just because I have very limited means doesn't mean that I need to include very few colors. A good example of this is Picasso's Blue Period. So if you're familiar with those paintings, they tend to be overwhelmingly blue. But if you look closer, there are a lot of different kinds of blues being used in those paintings. Warmer blues, greener blues, more purplish blues. In fact, Picasso probably used a number of different blue pigments to make those paintings. In a limited palette painting, there needs to be a lot of variety of color within that limited range. Okay, so I'm going to let that dry, and then I might make a few adjustments. Let's see, let's move on to the area that can be worked on without leakage. Probably this blue paper towel. We can also block in a little bit of the table here, but let's put in that blue paper towel. Now keep in mind that in this painting there are probably a few areas where you have pure color, where you have pure burnt sienna or pure ultramarine blue. So areas of pure burnt sienna might be here. Right, we have a few touches here. Areas of pure ultramarine might be here in the glaze on this picture. Everywhere else, there's going to be a mix. You're going to have some mixture of burnt sienna and blue in every other area, with the exception of a few spots. Don't use the color pure anywhere other than in those areas. Everything else is going to get a mix. Which leads me to another important principle. When mixing color, always be asking yourself this question: what's the difference? So we have a number of similar colors. We have a blue here, we have a blue here. What is the difference? In some places, the difference is going to be slight. So for example, the blue here and the lighter part of the picture here has a similar color. What's the difference? Well, the color here is a little bit darker and a touch more saturated, right? But you should be asking that same question everywhere. What's the difference between this color and this color, this color and this color, this color and this color? Always ask yourself, what is the difference? Which means when I'm looking at colors, I'm not just focusing on the color itself, I'm moving my eye from one part of the composition to the other and comparing one color against a color that's similar. It's only by color comparison that you can actually get the color right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start just by washing over the color with a big wash, but I'm also thinking about the way the color is moving generally. So there's some detail there, but generally speaking, the color is more saturated here, and going this way, it's starting to gray out a little bit. It's starting to turn slightly more blue in some areas, right? So I'm keeping the color moving everywhere, In some places the color gets a little bit darker, a little more saturated blue. In some places it gets darker, and because particularly here, right, the light from the little pumpkin is reflecting back onto the paper towel, and the color is becoming slightly grayer. Oh, that is not the correct color. So the color here starts becoming slightly more saturated blue. A little more strongly blue here. Again, there are notes of purple there, but I should be able to get fairly close. In fact, let's wash in this whole area. I'll be able to put a shadow color on top of this. Okay, so while we wait for this to dry, let's work on something else. That cast shadow is not quite dry yet, so we're going to wait for that. Let's see. Okay, let's wait a minute for things to dry, and then we'll get back to it. Okay, let's keep working on the larger areas. We have one large area to fill in right here. Let's pay attention once again to the way the color is moving. It's a similar warm gray here, and then it picks up quite a bit of blue from the paper towel here, and then here the color gets darker and, to my mind, slightly warmer. Here it starts picking up a touch of light blue. And here the color gets darker and warmer. Okay, I think we're ready to move on to the objects. This is drying, this is drying. Let's work on, well, just about the most difficult object, though the pumpkin is fairly tough too, this blue pitcher. We have a number of things going on here. First of all, we have a warm grayish glaze right here. We have a similar grayish glaze here. Then it starts going a little bit darker here, a little warmer here, a lot going on. What is the best way to start? I usually start off with the dominant color. So what is a dominant color? Well, it's kind of a blue. It's not pure. There might be areas where it goes more pure ultramarine. But I'm going to start off with something sort of in the middle. Let's isolate that highlight so that it looks really nice and bright. Trying not to lose it. And then some places the highlight has a softness to it. So I'm going to soften the edge. And then I'm paying attention to the way the color is moving. So generally speaking, the color is getting darker and more saturated blue. I want to leave room for those darker, bluer details on top. So I don't want to go so dark that I lose all that stuff, or lose the potential to go darker. And then what's happening to the color in the shadows? The color in the shadow gets darker and more muted, more gray. So a big mistake would be just to mix a darker blue here. Right? Generally speaking, shadows are going to be less saturated than whatever the color is in the light. And this is a very common mistake that, once again, beginners make. They make shadow colors too saturated. Right? They mix up simply a darker version of whatever color they're seeing in the light. Which makes the object feel transparent, translucent, like light is passing through it. So there will be situations where colors in the shadows are equally bright in objects that are plastic, and objects that have a semi-transparent surface to them. Okay, we missed a patch of blue there. All right, let's get the handle. Again, I'm looking for the average color here. I'm picking up a little bit of that gray glaze. There's a little bit more light hitting the handle. So we're going to go back to that very strongly saturated blue. And while this is drying, let's put in a bit of shadow. So we're seeing a shadow at the edge of the handle here. It's going darker and also more gray. Okay, not quite dry yet, but since the glaze is somewhat leaky, I think we can tackle it now. And in this case, as the glaze goes into the shadow, the color becomes more blue. Again, the main benefit of this exercise is that it allows you to think about the way color changes from warm to cool in a very simple way. Our options are limited. I'm not overwhelmed by that huge variety of mixing options that would be available if I had a palette of 12 colors. Sometimes watercolorists have palettes in the 30 color range, 3 different kinds of blues, 4 different kinds of green. I tend to use a more limited palette, but I understand. Right? Having a large variety of different blues, different greens, especially when you're doing landscape, gives you access to all the different kinds of greens that are visible in nature. But it definitely complicates things a lot. So the glaze here, a little lighter, a little more blue. Again, the more sensitive you are in picking up color differences, the better painter you're going to be. Whether you're using a full palette or a limited palette like this one, color sensitivity is key. And anytime there is a shift in value, I also think about the color shift. Now, in this case, we have a shift in local color. Glazed pottery tends to be very complicated. But the fantastic thing about watercolor is that because of the organic nature of the way washes move, they dry, it allows you to mimic many of the effects that you see in glazed pottery. All right, let's wait for this to fully dry, and then we'll make some adjustments. But in the meantime, let's tackle the pumpkin. We're going to look at the overall color here. What is the overall color? So we have some brighter values, which we'll put in later. We have some brighter values here. Generally speaking, the color is light and pretty warm. Almost pure burnt sienna, not quite. We want to leave room for color that's more saturated. So we might start off with something that looks like this. Again, I'm not going to be able to match the exact saturation. But I'm going to try to get as close as I can. And then, generally speaking, what happens to the color as it's moving towards the shadow? Well, we have increasing saturation towards the front. And then right here we have that pure, rich burnt sienna color. If you're using the synthetic version of burnt sienna, you're actually going to get closer. I'm not going to be able to get quite the saturation I'm seeing in this image. That's okay, that's not really the point. Yeah, the point is to think about warmth and coolness. And now let's get into the shadow color, which is darker and also more muted. So again, the big mistake would just be to mix up a darker version of this burnt sienna color. It's not going to look right. It needs to have more blue in it. How much? Well, compare this to this. Compare the shadow here to the shadow here. Make comparisons. Move your eye back and forth throughout the composition and compare colors one against the other. That needs to be darker, needs to be more blue. Not as blue as this, and also not as dark. What's happening to the shadow here? It's becoming a little lighter. Then we have quite a bit of stuff going on. So we have, let me adjust the edge here to keep it from going too sharp. We have a lighter value here, the reflected light. which is lighter and also a little warmer. Again, there's always as much happening in the shadows as the lights. It's just more subtle. And then the shadow goes darker, and once again, more blue. Okay, let's let that dry. In the meantime, let's work on the apple. Let's think about the color here. It's lighter, more gray, and then what happens to the color as it goes darker this way? It starts to cool down a little bit, right? Ever so slightly more blue, then it gets a little bit warmer. Then in the shadow, we have a number of things going on. The darker part of the shadow has some warmth to it. It has a warmer reflected light, but the shadow color here is highly influenced by the color of the paper towel. So there's a lot of blue, a lot of gray colors going on here. So let's start off with a slightly warmer color. So this is going to be a very light wash of burnt sienna with just a little bit of blue in it. Just a touch like this. Oh, we lost our highlight. Let's see if we can put it back in. And then the color immediately starts going slightly gray. So I'm going to work around the highlight. And the color starts going slightly grayer here. Slightly more blue. And then let's put in the shadow. So while this is still wet, we need to find a shadow color here that's a little warmer. Going this way. And then starts going more blue towards the bottom, where again you have a lot of color being reflected from the paper towel. Again, when working with color, pay attention to the way objects influence other objects. Everything is going to be influenced by everything else, right? Objects are all ever so slightly reflective. And this is something that I think often beginners are not aware of. So something that often happens in my beginning painting classes. I'll assign a still life, and a student will bring in a still life with a very bright background. And my question always is, did you invent the background, or was it actually there? And the reason why I ask that is because what often happens is that students will set up a still life, paint the objects, and when it comes to the background, maybe there's a bunch of busyness behind the objects. So a room, windows, furniture, right? They didn't bother putting anything behind the objects. So instead of painting all that stuff, they just take a bright green or a bright red or bright yellow and paint the space behind the objects. That can be a good option, but here's the problem. If I have a bright yellow behind the objects, it's going to reflect into the shadows. It's going to influence the color. So the reason why I can tell that a student invented a background as opposed to actually observed it is because the objects are not influenced by the colors around them. Right? So we can invent backgrounds. That's something illustrators often do. They'll take a number of references, let's say a penguin, and put it in the middle of the Sahara, in the middle of the desert, but what they'll do is they'll warm up the shadows. They'll take some of that yellow color from the sand and reflect it into the shadows of the penguin. And that'll create a convincing effect. It'll make it look like the penguin is actually in sand. If they leave all the shadows very blue, then it won't look right, right? The shadows, particularly the shadows, won't correspond with the surrounding colors, and everyone will be able to tell that you did kind of a cut and paste job. Okay, let's wait for this apple to dry and focus on cast shadows. Again, there's as much complexity in shadows as there is in the lights. You just have to look for it. And generally speaking, as the shadows go darker, the color becomes more muted, more neutral. So here, the shadow color is quite dark and almost perfectly balanced between burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, so it's going to be really dark. And then what happens to the shadow color as other colors reflect back into it? So we have a lighter value that's a little bit warmer, we have a darker value that's a little bit cooler. Right. Pay very close attention to color movement in cast shadows. There's going to be a lot. And it's your job as a painter to be sensitive to all the different movements of color. Again, just because you're working with a limited palette doesn't mean that your color scheme should be simple. The colors in the painting can be incredibly complex. There could be a lot going on in terms of color movement. So there is just a little bit of warmth inside that shadow. I'm going to see if I can pick that up. Okay, this might be dry enough that we can put in a cast shadow. So notice here the cast shadow is darker, right? There's not as much reflected light, and also more purple. Why? Because we don't have this the influence of this warm pumpkin reflecting back into the shadow color. When painting shadows, I always pay close attention to what's around the shadows. What's influencing the color in the shadow? It's going softer here. I'm going to use a little bit of water to soften the edge. And never leave cast shadows a single color. Never. Always pay attention to color distinctions within the shadow. So towards the bottom of this apple, I think we need to cut into it a little bit here. It's darker and. It's another good way of thinking about it. Lighter and. Darker and. Meaning and what other color? There's a cast shadow underneath the paper. There is a lot going on there. A lot. There's a warmer color. Then my suspicion is light is actually passing through the towel a little bit, creating a more saturated blue. Then all of a sudden it goes warmer here. It's in the corner. It's not important. But a good painter treats every part of the composition with equal attention. They think about absolutely everything, even what's happening in the corners. And when you go to the museum and you look at the masters, what distinguishes those masters from painters that are perhaps in the second tier is their attention to secondary detail. They'll spend as much time thinking about what's happening in the corners as they did in the center of the composition. Right? Treat every part of the composition with equal attention. So we have another cast shadow here. There's a lot going on in terms of color movement. So we have this kind of overall gray. Let's just wash that in. But I'm not going to make this color the same as this color. There's different things going on here. So what's happening there is a little more warmth towards the center of the shadow. Okay, while this is drying, let's work. Where should we work? Let's work a little more on the pot. The picture, excuse me. So let's work on the glaze. There is a darker, deeper reflection here. We can put that in. So those are the places where I'm going to be using more pure ultramarine blue. Right? There's those few spots where things get very strong and quite saturated. Again, we're not going to be able to get every single color. We might not be able to get the saturation. By the way, if I was using opaque media, I'd actually have more color options because I'm also going to be using white. So if you do this exercise, let's say in acrylic or oil, I can also add additional color complexity through transparency, through glazing. So I can put down one color and then glaze another color on top of it, which creates additional colors. So for example, for this pumpkin, as opposed to mixing up a strong burnt sienna mixed with white, what I'll do is I'll glaze over a transparent wash of burnt sienna, which is going to give me an even more saturated color. It's one of the sneaky ways that artists using a limited palette can add additional color complexity to their image through opacity and transparency. Now, watercolor, we don't have access to that because, well, you can, right? You can add white to watercolor. It's usually frowned upon among purists, but you can do it. There's nothing wrong with it. Okay, and here I'm going to start adding some additional texture, number one. So we have that uneven glaze. We can start doing that. But the glaze here goes darker, and what else? It also starts becoming more muted. Start working on the shadow. We can go a little bit darker. I left some room there. So I have a very, very strong dark color. And you can see with the burnt sienna, you can go pretty dark. Right? This is almost black. So in terms of value, this limited palette is not going to limit you. You should be able to get a very strong range of value. If you're using a dark ultramarine blue, if you're using a cobalt, you're not going to be able to do it. Okay, looks like I missed that slight highlight on the handle. I can use some white there, or perhaps even use an X-Acto knife or some kind of knife to scrape out that highlight. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to bother. Okay, so some places where the glaze goes a little bit darker, and we're working into a semi-dry surface is going to create that irregular glaze texture that I'm looking for. Again, something else to think about. And when people start watercolor, they either work wet into wet or wait for the paper to dry completely before working into the detail, right? However, you can also work as the paint is drying in a semi-dry stage, which creates all kinds of fun, irregular textures, granulation. Don't always have to wait for things to fully dry before you work into them. Okay, let's work on the shadow on the top of the picture here. Different color. It's warmer. Let's work on those little touches of glaze on the bottom. Again, we've got a warm color here, we have a warm color here. I'm paying attention to the difference. Sometimes you're going to have a color that's exactly the same, but more often than not, there's going to be a difference there. And emphasizing the difference makes all the difference. Don't repeat your colors. Don't make all the colors the same. Which is something that my painting students often are guilty of. They'll come in and they'll make the paper towel the same color as the picture. Yes, it happens. This exercise does a fantastic job of developing that color sensitivity. It eliminates the problem of having way too many colors to choose from, and allows students to focus again on those all-important qualities of warmth and of color difference. One thing you'll find is that a lot of painters paint quickly but spend a lot of time working on their palette, mixing the color on the palette, testing the color. Which is kind of a sneaky trick. Right? You can do a painting that's very gestural, really fast, but in reality, make a lot of very careful decisions, not on the painting, but on the way you mix the colors on the palette. Spend as much time working on your palette as you do on your painting. Okay, let's work on this pumpkin. Again, we're not going to be able to access all the colors here, but we're going to get close. In this case, this is one of the few spots where I'm using just the pure burnt sienna. Here and nowhere else. This again is where that synthetic burnt sienna color, which is more saturated orange would be helpful. But I'm going to be honest, I'm not a big fan of that synthetic burnt sienna. I'm not a fan of it in opaque technique. I'm not a fan of it in watercolor either. It is a very strong acidic color that to my mind just doesn't play well with other colors in your palette. That's just my personal opinion. In watercolor, a lot of people prefer it because, again, it has stronger saturation. It tends to create more even washes. But I'm not a fan of evenness either. And I like to let my washes move around a little bit. It makes the painting more expressive. And plus, those of you that watch my channel, I often combine my watercolor with pen. And my pen work tends to be tighter. And that combination of tight pen work with looser washes can create a very pleasing effect, which I enjoy. So again, this is the only spot where I'm using pure burnt sienna. You can see I'm limiting those areas where I'm working things, I'm using the pigments in their pure form, right? There's a few places where we have pure ultramarine, a few places where there's pure burnt sienna, nowhere else. Okay, and let's go in and put in some of those darker shadows. And never mixing one big pile of any color and putting it down everywhere. Sometimes you'll see painters mix up big piles of paint. This happens obviously in oil painting, not in watercolor. And watercolor too. Like, they use these big palettes with lots and lots of paint. Usually when they're working on larger paintings. I tend not to do that. My philosophy is keep looking, keep mixing, keep remixing. I never mix big piles of anything, even when I'm working on a larger painting. Yeah, it takes more time, constantly having to be mixing colors. But I think it results in a painting that's more nuanced when you do that. And I think what happens, the tendency, when you mix big piles of color, you stop looking. You stop observing, and that is a painting killer. Right? When you're so focused on the painting that you stop looking. Right? You see that in lots of situations in figure drawing, where a student stops looking at the figure and starts rendering. No, you should always be looking. Always be questioning your color. Is it correct for that specific spot? All right, let's add some finishing touches to the paper towel. Again, how is the color changing from here to here? Never mix a big pile of anything and put it down everywhere. Keep the color and the value moving. Okay, let's put in a few little additional details on the pumpkin. even in areas like this that are very small, I'm going to see if I can pick up some color differences. Okay, this needs to be washed in. It needs to be just a touch darker. And what else is going on? More blue. What's happening here? A little more blue, and let's mute the color down just a little bit. Okay. So I think we're going to call this exercise complete. I might work a little bit on it off camera and finish it up for you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, I'm going to call this exercise more or less complete, though 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, let's think about what else needs to be done. I forgot to cast shadow off the picture. How could I do that? Again, a lot going on in terms of color. So towards the center of the shadow, it gets darker, more blue. Towards the edges of the shadow, it becomes lighter, more brown. Always as much happening in the shadows as there is in the lights, if you're paying attention. What else? Well, perhaps there's a few details missing in the glaze. We can go a little bit darker. Perhaps this is just a little bit too saturated. I can wash it over. But I think we can call this little exercise complete. Here is the more or less complete exercise, but the plot thickens because there's actually a second, more difficult part to it, which is to tackle a subject with colors that are completely inaccessible with this severely restricted palette. Let's say a landscape with strong greens, yellows, purples, reds, etc. That's what we're going to do in the second part of this tutorial. Here's the landscape we're going to use, which will be available to channel members. In this exercise, we're going to learn to translate the colors we're seeing into the language of warm and cool and get the fullest benefit from using this limited palette. Thank you so much for watching, and see you back in my messy studio very soon. Bye for now.